Well, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Amina. These were two wonderful ways to start off. Amina, in the conference earlier today at Chatham House, there was a lot of talk about how multilateralism is on its back foot at the moment, on the defensive. And so I suppose where I wanted to start was, given that Kofi's sort of legacy is a very progressive, ambitious one of building and initiatives and of working for a UN which is in every way bigger and larger in its ambition. What bits of his legacy do you see in the UN of today? Where is there still that push and enthusiasm that you so associated yourself with? Because I think he would look at you as one of the next generation carrying forward his torch. And so where's that torch going at the moment in the UN?
I think in a couple of directions. I mean, certainly, as I said, there are huge headwinds, even on the floor of the General Assembly or in our Security Council. You see almost no movement, and even when there is, it's very little. And so what we did see is people rallying around the framework for the SDGs. It seemed to be one framework that everyone could identify with, and taking profit with that to do something I think he started years ago on the reform, and take some really bold steps to say that for us to face these headwinds, the UN needs to communicate with today, and not just to rest on the laurels of the past where it was recognized and thought of to be the answer to many, many challenges. The solutions were found with us. And I think that having the courage to face that perhaps we don't have all the answers, and that we have to have a different relationship with member states, particularly at the country level, and to be brave enough to do that, because I think very often those of us who work in the UN, you know that once you get into a position of leadership, if you open your mouth, you're expected to be right. So how do we do this, and how do we do that, and you bring it out to actually say, well, in this case, I don't know. It's a collective reflection that we need to have in order to get that. That's changing now, that people are more willing to sit around a table and to reflect. And I think that both the Secretary General and myself think that leadership needs to come from a place where we're including everyone and really pushing for the core values of the UN. Perhaps another place that I see this is that we have, and it's not the first time, there have been voices that have been against. He was certainly in an era where there were voices against the UN. And was that tenacity not to exclude. The temptation would be to say, well, let them get on with it, and I'm going this way. But you need to keep everyone in the tent. And many a time you'll be wondering, why would I want those people in this tent? But actually, you need them. That's what we're about. We're about this global village. And I think that's still very much alive, that we dig deep and we are able to keep those doors open and to try to convince people, even though we have, I think, in the last 2 to 3 years, we've lost a lot of ground on things we took for granted, on human rights, on multilateralism, on peacekeeping. You wore a helmet and you went out there. Even as a humanitarian worker, you could walk through many a storm and nothing would touch you. But today, you've become a target. And you have to ask yourself why, and to reflect and to come out stronger and just not give up.
Thank you, Amina. Mary, I mean, a little bit to pick up on Amina's point that human rights is one of those areas where there is a sense that things have gone backwards. And again, today at Chatham House, there was, a feeling that the ICC might be fatally damaged. There was, quite a lot of questioning of whether the responsibility to protect could survive Libya. And yet, to be honest, I remember, going back to when you were High Commissioner, and frankly, given that I was in and out of the UN earlier in my career, going back to periods well before that too, that the relationship between a Secretary General and a High Commissioner, even when there is all the mutual trust and respect and friendship there was between you and Kofi, is inherently a difficult one, because it's the values and principles and legal obligations which we have to hold states to up against raw politics, which is where a Secretary General also has to operate. Thoughts about then and now?
Yes. raw politics and diplomacy.
Yeah.
Trying to find a solution in difficult situations. No, I acknowledge, and in fact, when we met as High Commissioners recently, we kind of reflected that no High Commissioner has done a full second term. I did an extra year, which happened to be the year which began with 9/11. Lucky bee. Yeah. And then I think Navi Pillay did 2 years extra. But nobody is, it's such a difficult job. In fact, the best advice I got before I took up the post of High Commissioner for Human Rights was from a poet friend of mine, who's now the professor of poetry in Stanford University, Van Boland. She said, well, Mary, she wanted me to seek a second term as President of Ireland. And I said, no, I want to do something else. She said, well, very well, she said, but just know that if you become popular in that job, you're not doing a good job. And I think that was even true in the UN system at times. Yeah. And I found that, that you had to be the voice and be strong because it is difficult and because people need to hear a voice in the UN, which is truth to power at all costs. And actually, the lovely thing is that the elders are truth to power. And when we were in China recently, we got a kind of hint that the elders shouldn't raise human rights. And since I was leading a very good group of elders, Ernesto Zedillo, Lakhdar Brahimi, I'm going to forget now who was with me.
That's
the trouble.
Being an elder.
Yes, Ricardo Lagos. And anyway, I began by reflecting on my visits as High Commissioner, and that on my first visit I had gone to Tibet, and that and sort of create a scene, and that I'd met with his predecessor, Jiang Zemin, on several occasions, and it kind of, and then at the end said that we wanted to be able to talk about difficult issues like human rights, and we recognized that China has 56 ethnicities, it has, huge problems, a huge population, but, and that door was left very open for future, which was important.
But so. I could push you on that just for a second, Mary, and just say that the Elders is a non-governmental organization around a group of individuals of great, personal standing and authority. And that, therefore, in a sense, may give you a certain slack with the Chinese authorities that the UN proper doesn't have. And therefore, I've always wondered whether there may not be periods when state sensitivities will be so high that we should just have to accept that progress on human rights is going to come through non-governmental organizations who can be robuster, tougher, push the message harder than an intergovernmental organization like the UN.
Yes, I certainly absolutely believe that human rights depends on human rights defenders around the world, and they were the ones that energized me. They were the ones who inspired me completely. And they were so strong in very difficult contexts and environments, including China. And they're still there. Yeah. I think the UN has to, insofar as possible, be the guardian of the norms and values. That is the strength of the UN. It's not as sort of strong economically as the World Bank, if you like, or other, but it is the guardian of the norms and standards and values, and holding to account and not having impunity. And it's hard at the moment because when I was serving as High Commissioner, basically we had many more countries who would help you in the Human Rights Commission as it was then, and the Human Rights Council as it is now, with issues. Now, countries are not willing to engage, or there's a sort of there is a very good change, which is the Universal Periodic Review. It's not strong, but it's the strongest review system we have in the UN, and I think it's working over time, partly because countries are learning to sort of hear accusations made about them from countries that are not known for their record in human rights, criticizing countries that are maybe trying to reach a higher standard, and they remember and repeat the next time, get that country, you accused us, now what about your human rights? And it's become more of a dialogue of peers holding each other to account, and that's helpful.
Yeah. Let me, if I may, come back, Amina, to you on an issue which may or may not be a little sensitive in terms of the current UN, and that is communications. I mean, you saw Kofi this extraordinary level of culture that he was able to penetrate, popular television in America and around the world. He's the only Secretary General, I think it's probably fair to say, who was a globally recognized person who would be stopped on the street and greeted, say when he wasn't mistaken for Morgan Freeman or Morgan Freeman for him. That to traditionalists was always seen as, oh gosh, isn't that going to compromise his power to be a behind-the-scenes negotiator of conflicts? Well, I think those of us who worked with him felt exactly the opposite. It was this communications power he built. It was almost, he came after not that long after Ronald Reagan had been president in the US and when Clinton still was. And you saw in these presidents individuals who knew how to communicate over the heads of their Congress to build public opinion in support of what they were doing. And Kofi seemed to be the first global political figure who had that similar command of the media of the day to be able to do that. And, I understand that the media of today is a lot more reckless and violent. It's social media, it's cable news, it's everything else. And, it's very hard to control the narrative and message on it. But it is striking how his successors seem to have been much more low profile than he was. And, you think of your colleague Antonio Guterres, a wonderful Secretary General, brilliantly articulate in many languages, all the communication skills of a former prime minister. So there's got to be something structural or deliberate about it that successors have been more low profile.
I think everyone comes to the job with different set of assets, and how you deploy them would be your success. And I think we also come into a different environment. And I think the real challenge that we've had, both as a system and in leadership, is that the world is far more threatening and less tolerant of the latitude that was given to Kofi to be able to communicate the way he did. I think that today we have social media, we have different types of opportunities to engage, but in a much more difficult environment. And I think that we are looking at the existence, the relevance of the UN. And when that happens, I think it's a very fine line that you walk between communicating and bringing the world on board to support multilateralism, to support what we do together, because we can go further together. And so I think that's very tough. I think communicating today is tough. Having said that, I think you also have to find a hook that allows you to do that, and to remember that actually there's a charter there that allows you to do many things that we sometimes forget when we get lost in the day-to-day challenges of what member states may put up in front of you, and they become barriers. And I think it's, again, a choice, and how to deploy that, what you have as a charisma and the ability to do these things. I think that Kofi drew very deeply on his African origins and his sense of communication. And I think that really helped. It's different from the previous, even the previous Secretary General that I worked with, different style, and made different impact in different places. But, it depends what the audience is. Yeah. And, I think that we often want to see the UN, I'm sort of thinking, what is the UN to be for the 21st century? How much of it do we need to change? We just spoke about human rights now. I think we need a different narrative for human rights. The human rights narrative that we've had in the past worked because, frankly, there was not the same empowerment and knowledge and positions taken by countries that in those days took it, we sign on the dotted line. That's what people did. You have to own the agenda. When we speak about human rights in our countries, they are in our constitutions. It's not something separate. But if we feel that we're prescribing and that we are communicating prescription to people, they won't take it. Yeah. So look at the way now that Michelle Bachelet will try to speak. I mean, very close, and as you said, relationship with Antonio Guterres is unparalleled. But there are tough times, and currently we say, okay, as Michelle says, let's be loud, but let's be smart about it. how you come at this. We have the reform and we struggle with what does the development side do for human rights? And so the first thing we do is to lean on the UPR and say that's something states have agreed. Can we actually implement that within what we do, and can we communicate it? But I do think there are huge challenges for communication today. Communicating a good message, should it be the UN that is the messenger? If we say that the UN belongs to all of us, is it not a message that should be carried by everyone? I find that the voices of those outside, the friends of the UN today, are very quiet. The voices that are not for the UN, not for multilateralism, are far louder. And yet I think that we need to somehow inspire and move voices who are for it.
Mark, could I kind of take an issue that I think is very timely and we can move forward on, to fulfill a legacy that Kofi has, if you like, urged on us. He spoke a lot about climate change and indeed climate justice. And when we go back to 2015, I was the Special Envoy to the Secretary General observing the work that you were doing, Amina and others, and the negotiations for the 2030 agenda. And we ended up with a very interesting, well-crafted package of the 2030 agenda and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals because countries thought it was voluntary. Frankly, they're much more prepared to agree if it's voluntary. So that was one of the reasons. And then we came to the Paris Climate Agreement that December, and the bits that were supposed to be binding of a treaty got watered down, and it was almost voluntary. There's not much, it's not much really binding, except hopefully increasing ambition, etc. And it was Tony de Broom taking part in all these ministerial meetings who got into the ear of the other negotiators, and he kept saying, as a minister, the foreign minister of the Marshall Islands, do you want my country to go under? We have to put 1.5 into the text, and it was 1.5 to stay alive. That was the mantra. And we got the goal, staying well below 2 degrees and working for 1.5 degrees. And then the Paris Agreement had to ask the scientists to explain what's the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and how do we stay at 1.5 if we should, if we must. And that was what the scientists reported on last October. And what they said was the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is huge. That's when the coral reefs will disappear. That's when the Arctic ice will disappear. That's when the permafrost begins to seriously melt and exude these greenhouse gas emissions. And so 2 degrees is the outer limit of what is safe for our world. And then what must we do? And they said we need to reduce by 45% carbon emissions by 2030. They said we have 12 years. Now it's 11 years and we're already in June. And carbon emissions went up last year. They had been going down in 2017, they went up in 2018. So we have a huge issue. And I believe this is an enormous opportunity for the UN and a whole coalition of partners to say, when the 2030 agenda was negotiated, members who negotiated thought it was voluntary, and they more or less reduced the Paris Agreement into being, but science tells us now it is imperative. It has to be done, we have to do it. And the school children and the Extinction Rebellion and the young people are coming out and saying, we're looking at what the science is telling us, we see it. And then we had the extinction of species, 1 million species about to be extinct report more recently. So I think the UN can really step up and help to shape a connecting the dots, huge mobilization. It's already happening. Women's leadership is bubbling up on this issue. African women leaders and Asian women leaders have had climate change top of the agenda for quite a while. Now it's happening in Europe and in the United States. Lots of groups, lots of Women Deliver, I'd say, will be very interesting from that point of view in Vancouver, because climate change will be much, much more important. So you've got youth, including children, you've got women leaders, you've got business leaders who are non-fossil fuel, the B team that I work with, who made a commitment in January of 2015 to be net zero carbon emissions by 2050, and to do it the climate justice way, with just transition, to think about the workers in coal, steel, oil and gas. And so I would love, I think this is what Kofi would want, that the UN would sort of take, step up and say, This is no longer voluntary. You made these commitments, you negotiated them, they're your text, implement, and implement with ambition. And then we can do it. What the scientists said is it is doable if we have the political will. And I think this is the way we could create a real political will. We have less than 12 years now. We have 10 and a half years in some measure to get on track. We're not on track at the moment. We're on track for a 3 or 4 degree world. It's not a safe world for the future. That is the kind of urgent issue that I think the UN can really lead on, and you've got a wonderful opportunity with the climate summit coming up to
But that's
do
it.
that.
That's the opportunity we have. So it's exactly those things that you say. It's exactly those groups that are currently working with us that go to Abu Dhabi in the end of June and that go to the summit. And that is not a member state summit. I think this is really important because while it was a voluntary framework, it's just because it was voluntary that you now have huge, big member states that say we actually don't want to see in any text the SDGs anymore. We don't want to see 1.5 degree because the science isn't correct. So you have member states who will put this on the table. The climate summit is the SG's response to the urgency that you talk about. And I think that what we need is for people to join that movement for the climate summit and not talk about the UN's climate summit, but what you're doing about getting on board to be part of the UN climate summit. This is not just for the SG. This is an opportunity to bring the world together and to galvanize those voices. We talk about Greta's voice. It's an incredible voice, another opportunity that I hope that we won't waste. Because as we went through the annals of history, from 1992, we've had about 12 Gretas. And they've been equally impressive at each moment in time when they've spoken. We had an incredible speaker in 2014. It was one of the reasons why you got so much of that momentum in Paris to get the agreement that we had. But this is something that we have to do day in, day out. And it's one of the reasons that we look at the summit in 2019 is about us hitting the ambition that we've set for 2020. So don't wait till 2020. Say that in 2019, as we're taking stock for the SDGs, it's not good enough that the SDGs are not being met, but it's even worse that we're getting the science to say that we really are very way off track. We are 3-4 degree world. So I think that what we do in September, when the SG says close your coal plants down, when he says come not with more rhetoric, but with actual commitments, so that we can see the G20. We have 170 odd countries that signed on to Paris. It's the G20 that has 82% of the emissions today. And yet, when we talk and we ask for countries to come up and do their NDCs or climate, we're talking about Africa and 2 degrees. Yeah. What we need is investments in Africa to do what it is that the 82% is causing, and to actually have a louder voice for the G20 to say enough is enough. You've got a responsibility here, and that's what the Climate Summit is about. So it gets us to 2020 with results that we can get hopefully back on track. As Christine Figueres would say, bend the curve so that we make a difference. The other thing I would say is that the framework for the SDGs, Goal 13 is climate. So it's not climate and the SDGs. It is an integral part that we put a placeholder for December. And I think siloing it and separating it also doesn't do well for us as a community that understands that climate change is not a siloed issue that we have to deal with. It is very much an integral one that is about people and is about planet.
Absolutely. Thank you. I think the enthusiasm of people's response to what both of you have said just shows that there are issues out there which climate change is clearly the predominant, which do lend themselves to UN campaigning leadership as part of a much broader coalition. And, are sort of such earth-threatening issues that they're worth taking some real risks on, I think is probably the sentiment of this room. I want to now just bring in a few comments from people not in the room who've sent in these questions to you both via the social media. And the first two, from a 19-year-old called Rowan Mooney and a 25-year-old called Faiza Ali, are both really about how do you think a Secretary General should behave at a time of world leaders behaving aggressively towards one another? Should a Secretary General act with calm reserve, or should he push back a bit and be more combative? And the Pfizer's question is, The move away from centrist politics has deepened political distrust and turbulence across the world. Where is the space for the other Kofi Annans of our time in a world dominated by a retreat from liberalism and a shift towards near autocratic populism? What needs to change about the way we do international diplomacy? Amina, would you like to take that first?
I think it's not either or. I think he has to do both.
Yeah.
I think there are times when he has to do the back room or back corridor work, and he does a lot of that currently. But there's also the time that you have to find the space and look for it proactively to have a voice out there. More recently, that happened in Aachen in Germany, where he spoke to the climate issue, and he spoke very vigorously about that. And he was accompanied by Greta and by other speakers. So I think choosing the moment where the voice will not be drowned out, but will carry and bring a momentum with it that can connect across the regions. So I think it's not either or, I think it's both. And I think we have to do also more to engage with other leaders. I think the elders do an incredible job because they have that space to do it. And perhaps what we ought to do is to be saying, what is the collaborative effort that we need? Where he can't go, you can go. And we need to find that synergy to make this work. That's what the universal agenda is about today. It's not just the north-south piece.
But also, I think, yes, there is populism, and there's kind of identity politics, but there's also a movement, particularly of young people. The Green parties in the European elections did very well. The Liberal Democrats, those who want to see a more progressive future. The Green New Deal in the United States. The fact that a polling of Republicans in the United States shows young Republicans want some kind of Republican Green Deal. That's interesting in itself. So I think. I think this is a bumpy time for multilateralism, but it's a time to utterly defend it. The elders are very engaged, and Ernesto Zedillo brought a group together in Yale. We will have a paper soon staunchly defending the multilateral system as being the only system of rule of law, of rights, that protects countries, that protects people. And we will be strongly affirming that and encouraging it. But I'm actually, I'm more... I learned the word from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I don't usually use the word optimist. I'm a prisoner of hope, because that's what he taught me to be, a prisoner of hope. And I am hopeful that young people are getting very engaged in what's happening in our world, that women leaders are doing. I mean, the byline of my podcast that that Mark mentioned, Mothers of Invention, the byline is, climate change is a man-made problem and requires a feminist solution. And Maeve Higgins, my partner, who was 8 years old when I was elected president, and part of the fun is she's not very respectful. She's half respectful, but she will never explain. But I like to explain, especially to an audience like this, that man-made is generic. It includes men and women. Men were probably more responsible, they had more power to pollute and everything else, but we're all responsible. And a feminist solution definitely includes men. And the feminist solution that we're hearing in this podcast is fascinating. Getting rid of the patriarchal society and norms, asserting a real equality. It's very refreshing to listen to voices from around the world, and extraordinarily entrepreneurial women. And we've had 2 good men so far. We'll have men from time to time, when we just want to give them a little voice, give them a little space. But
well, I'm really doubly glad I managed to find my way on stage. Just a question from, and I think Natalie and her team have deliberately chosen a group of young questions from younger people who've come in by the difficulty of their names. So from Kleber Almeida Paucha Molina, aged 23, comes the question that apart from activism, what other means do young people have to make their voices heard by the governments, so that it's not only a symbolic gesture, but real actions are taken? And I know what Kleber means, because we've just had an extraordinarily impactful Extinction Rebellion set of events here. And Yes, we then sustained it through the very successful Green vote in the European elections. But there is a sense that, then politics starts to drift back to normal. How do you really kind of push in a sustained way for change? Mary, maybe you'd start on this one.
Well, I have usually 3 messages for any captive audience, and after all, this is a captive audience, so I'll be quick. 3 steps that we should all be taking now, and it's in this context of the existential threat of climate change, the short time we have, but it's doable. So I'm saying everyone should take climate change personally in their lives and do something they weren't otherwise doing. And I've become a pescatarian. I don't eat meat anymore. I love lamb from the west of Ireland. I'm still in withdrawal, but it's more than a year now, and I don't cheat. That's just my little thing of saying, make it personal. Then the second step is get angry and get active. Get angry with governments at all levels, including even city level, and business, particularly fossil fuel business, agri-business, big business that's part of the real polluting problem, and get active in supporting those who are fighting for climate change, fighting the effects of climate change, conservation, trying to promote a lifestyle that will fair fashion, whatever it is. And the third thing, and I think this is the most important thing, is we've got to imagine this world we want to see. And I think I told you this, Amina, before, but I had the good fortune to be invited to go to Venice last November for the Architectural Biennale. And it was because 2 Irish women architects were curating the whole Biennale, and I was very proud of them, they're friends, and they had chosen the earth is our client, and us architects to reflect on it. And we saw wonderful examples of circular economy, of mobility, of shared living, it was just exciting. And I think too often we think of climate change is going to destroy whatever we have of comforts in our life or something, and instead of that, we will have a much healthier life. We won't have the fumes, which are also hitting London now, and children are worried about, our parents are worried about children and asthma in London. I hear a lot of complaints, but it's happening far more in big cities in the developing world. And it'll be, if we achieve the 2030 agenda as being required, if we take a stand and say this is no longer voluntary, think what that will mean. We'll leave no one behind. We'll get to that billion people who never switch the switch for electricity. We'll get to the 2.3 billion who still cook on dirty cook stoves. All the gadgets are there. We need the moonshot approach. And I really get very excited about the potential of the urgency of our situation and how, if we can get everybody to take those 3 steps, make it personal, get angry and get active, and thirdly, imagine this world we want to rush to, I think it'll help.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the get angry bit is the one thing that is valid through generations. If we ever don't get angry at what we are seeing, which is quite frankly a lack of engagement with the urgency to act, I think you have to with the representation that you have. I do think that young people have an opportunity to make the parallel government, if you would, entrepreneurism. I mean, I think young entrepreneurs are doing amazing work. They need more support. We need to scale up what they're doing. And I think that spirit needs to come into a country so that you're not waiting for government to do something. I think you have to advocate for that, or you have to move in whichever way you feel you can to get them to do things in a parliament and an executive, local government, mayors, but you can't stop and just wait. So therefore I think the entrepreneurial spirit is to look around. What is the market around you? We've never been more skilled or had more access to technology or resources than today. What we need to do is share it. And if we can find the spirit of crossing borders amongst young people with that entrepreneurial spirit, I think then we will start to have a mass movement of can-do and are not waiting. I think the collaborations, we cannot do this alone. And so the collaborations around movements need to happen. We see too many people working in silos. And those silos, I think we have to come out of and we have to reach across within the sectors. It does not even in a cabinet have to be your sector responsibility. It's how you engage someone else's responsibility to impact on the life that we're all looking for. And I think that's That's perhaps a little bit more different because it's got to do with the way donors fund us, it's got to do with the way budgets are made, and so they tend to sort of, you follow the money. I think you need to get the money following you because you have the best idea, you have the evidence to show that this works, and that's a value proposition that people want to go for. And third, for those who have a day job, it's to remember that you're one of the 7.5 billion when you go back home. And so how do you bring that personal passion and commitment into your day job and not think that it's something that you do after work? It has to happen 24/7 to make the changes that we need to have now on climate action and on achieving the SDGs.
Amina, thank you. Mary, thank you. Let me just say in closing this part, listening to these two extraordinary colleagues here on stage with me and reflecting on all that I've heard today from Nan and other speakers earlier in the day as well, one is reminded of the range of this man. He was both an extraordinary diplomat in the most traditional sense. The former Prime Minister of Kenya spoke to us about Kofi's absolutely hands-on negotiation of the settlement of the disputed 2008 election. He was a man of huge, sweeping, progressive ideas around development reflected in the Millennium Development Goals, around environment and climate change. He was a man who saw that the UN could have extraordinary purpose and a vaunting ambition, and this was reflected in his astonishing communication skills that we've commented on as well. And how did he hold all of this together as someone like many in this room who was lucky to work very closely with him over a long period of time? I first knew him as a young field officer in the UN High Commissioner for Refugees when he was our Director of Personnel in the Bureau of Management there. I remember him taking me out for a walk along the lake when I was back from some particularly grim refugee emergency where, a lot of lives had been lost and was feeling really down. And just the sort of friendship and comradeship. I don't think he literally threw an arm around my shoulders. The physical difference between us would have made that a very ungainly walk. But he was just so comforting and reassuring. And that was what linked all the different Kofis together, whether it was an incredibly tricky negotiation with Saddam Hussein to try and head off that war, or whether it was pushing for more women in senior jobs in the organization, or being on the stage of Sesame Street. This was a man whose values and sheer decency and friendship never slipped. All day people have been saying he never raised his voice. You really got worried when he went extra quiet. This was somebody whose just profound humanity and decency moved and shaped a generation, as you heard from Natalie, who shaped a world. And his legacy must be not just that we don't forget that, but we bring the world back to Kofi's world. Thank you both very, very much indeed. Natalie.